Hi, and welcome to this video on the installation of the 20mm profile linear guide rails. My name is David McCaddy, and I am the team lead for the mechanical hardware team at Vention. All of the steps, the parts, and the tools that we're going to be using throughout this instruction can be followed along using the technical document found on vention.com. And with that, let's move on to unboxing our parts. So once your parts are unboxed, you're going to have a couple different pieces of hardware. Here we have the bearing box itself, the linear bearing mount, and the hardware mounted to associate it. Here we have a selection for MOLM 490001. This is a bearing kit for standard extrusions. Over here we have a slightly different bearing kit. This one again, we have the bearing mount and the hardware, but this is for MOLM 0490003. Which is used exclusively for our XL extrusions, or the 247.5mm extrusions. Moving on, here we have in the front, this is the linear guide rail, so they will always come in this vacuum packaged compartment here. And this is for sake of corrosion protection, and meaning that there's a rust inhibitor inside, and once we open this up, we'll wipe it down, make sure it's all clean before we go on to the installation. But you want to make sure that you only do that just before you're going to install to make sure that they stay protected from contaminants and corrosion. Similarly, inside the bearing box, you will also have a vacuum sealed bearing here. And inside this vacuum seal, you can just tear this open. Likewise, only open this once you're ready to do the installation. Here we have our bearing block with this plastic insert. We want to make sure that this stays inside until we're installing the bearing on the rail itself. Within the plastic here, we'll also find the Zerk fitting, so the grease fitting that can be installed on the bearing. Right here, so a little one like that. And for the bearing installation on the mount, what we're going to do is take the mount here, orient our bearing so that this surface, you can see on one side there is a proud surface that has been surface ground, whereas the other side is smooth. We want to take this side that has the registry surface. This is the datum of the bearing. And we want to place it so that it's inside that top corner of the bearing mount. Now we can align the holes of the bearing with the holes of the mount, like so. Place the fastener inside, and here we're using a 4mm Allen key to attach this screw, attaching the bearing mounting block to the bearing itself. So for now, we're just going to be doing these approximately finger tight, maybe 1 to 2 Newton meters in terms of installation torque. And this is just so that everything is held together during the installation. We'll be doing full torquing to full specification once it's installed on the rail itself. So again, I'm just loosely snugging these up. And the whole time I am also holding the bearing up against this top surface here, and that ensures that that registration edge is contacting the inside of the mount and that the bearing will mount nice and square. So that's the installation process for the standard bearing mount. Now for the bearing mount for the XL extrusion, or the 247 extrusion. So again, this kit, the part number is MLM 490003. This is 490001, so that's the difference. The bearing inside the box is exactly the same. Just like before, we're keeping this plastic insert installed, and this bearing also has the lip side, the side with the datum, and then the completely smooth side. So on this assembly, you can see actually that this bearing mount has a hinging mechanism. This is to allow for slight misalignments in the very large extrusion. Because of its large form factor, it can have some angular misalignment. So this is why we have this hinging mechanism. That being said, we need to also register that datum surface on the bearing on the correct side of this mount. So here we have our datum surface. We're going to be putting it against this top edge here. So again, bearing datum surface against this top edge here, placing it in like that. Now we can flip the system around, and just like the other bearing mount, we want to install the screws into the holes to attach these together. There are 2 additional fasteners that we need to also install on this version of the bearing mount. There are 2 set screws in the bottom here, and what this does is it actually pushes that datum feature that we had installed on the top here against the top registration surface, and this actually adds some additional rigidity to the bearing as well. So here we're using M6 set screws, and these we can start by hand. And then here I'm using a 3mm Allen key with these M6 set screws to screw them in the rest of the way. Similar to the bolts on the face, we're not torquing these to final spec, but we want to make sure that we feel them bottom out and then turn them a tiny little bit more just to make sure there's a little bit of preload to make sure all the correct surfaces are pushing together. So at this point, on either of your bearing systems, you'll probably want to install your grease fitting at this point because you'll have to be able to rotate it, and while it's on the rail, you won't be able to fully rotate the Zerk fitting. So for that, we'll be using a very small little 1.5 millimeter Allen key to remove a small set screw that is located in the end of the block. So here we go. Now with that set screw removed, you can put that to the side and keep it for later in case you want to reinstall it to reseal the bearing. And we can thread in this grease fitting. This grease fitting is going to get snug, and you want to also make sure that it's facing upwards, so away from the opening of the bearing here. You don't want it to be installed like this because it will actually knock on the bearing when you install it. You want to make sure that the grease fitting is facing up when you're done finally torquing it in place. And this is not installed with a lot of torque, but you can finish off the rotation with either an adjustable or a 6 millimeter wrench. And we'll just rotate this, like I mentioned, until that grease fitting is facing outwards. Like so. And at this point, you've completed the installation of your bearing mount onto your bearing, and we're ready to move on to the next steps of mounting the bearing rail onto the extrusion itself and then mating them together afterwards. So now we've reached the point of installing the linear guide rail onto the extrusion. In this case, we're using a XL247 extrusion, but all of the hardware here is going to remain the same, whether you're doing it on one of these or a standard extrusion. So the same applies to both. In terms of tools that we're going to need for this step, we have a torque wrench here set to 10 Newton meters. Anything from 10 to 11 Newton meters is acceptable. We have also a 4 millimeter driver, as well as a 3 millimeter driver. And then just for the convenience of not having to always use the torque wrench for the beginning installation steps, we have a 4 millimeter hex Allen key. In terms of the components we have here, we have the guide rail itself, which we showed before, unboxing, removing it from that vacuum sealing and wiping off that corrosion inhibitor. We also have here, these are the rail supports. So this is what gets sandwiched between the rail and the extrusion and is what aligns it properly. We also have these binding plates, and these squeeze the rail into the correct datum feature on the rail support. To connect this all together, we have our hardware over here, which includes 30 millimeter M5s, as well as 15 millimeter M5s, and the associated T-nuts. So special care needs to be taken if your rail system is blocked on both ends. So if you have extrusions on both ends or some other components that are going to prevent you from installing your bearing afterwards. And this is because once it's mounted, the bearing actually needs to go off the end of the rail to be installed. So if that is your case, you'll need to pay particular attention and actually approach the installation slightly differently by first installing the T-nuts into the extrusion, then mounting the bearing onto the rail off the extrusion, and then mounting them together afterwards. What I'm going to be showing is instead an installation process that is used when you have access to the end of the extrusion, and I personally find is a little bit easier. So to assemble the supports and the rail system in through the end of the extrusion, like I mentioned, we're first going to take this guide rail support, and you'll see here that has a bit of an L shape. This bottom part of the L, this is a datum surface for the bottom of the rail. The rail itself, it also has some text here, which may be a little bit difficult to see on camera, but it's just good to keep track of the orientation of this text and to keep it always facing up, just so the rails are installed in a consistent manner. So what we're going to be doing here is taking these supports and lining them up with 3 holes here on the rail. We're going to be putting the fasteners in, and then simply on the other side we're going to be lightly installing one of these T-nuts, just loosely so that it's on a few threads like this. Now it's captive, and we'll be repeating this process for all of the supports and all of the hardware. So it is important to note that some rails, depending on the length, may have full continuous support from these supports, or they may actually be spaced like we have in this case. So some may be up against each other like this, some may be separated like that. The important thing to note here is that we're never skipping more than one fastener, and this is to ensure that the rail is properly supported along its entire length. All of these supports are installed. We'll be installing it so that the support is on the bottom of the rail. Again, you can look at the text on the rail, it should be facing up. And we're going to take this whole assembly with them loose like this, and we're going to start sliding them into the T-slot of the extrusion. So the T-nuts, I'm just helping to guide them into the T-slot while we're going through. So now that the rail is mounted in the extrusion, you'll probably want to position it to be the center or wherever it is in the machine builder design, so it's at the correct location. So you might want to double check that with a measuring tape. And you'll see that it's also still quite loose. That's totally okay. That's just for installation. And now we're going to start tightening up the bolts with this 4mm Allen key. So here we don't want to fully tighten them. We just want to tighten the bolts enough so that it's not loose anymore. So I didn't go full tight, but you'll see that it's rattling on that side, but this side it's a lot more defined. And we're just going to continue that along the rail. So now that I've hand tightened all these fasteners, you can see it's a little bit more snug, but I am still able to move it around a little bit by hand. This is perfect. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to install these binder plates. So these have a shape here so that when they're tightened down, they actually press on the rail into the datum of the bottom of the rail mount. And they go on the top just here. And we're going to be using these M5 by 15mm bolts to attach them just through the top. So now that we're done torquing with the Allen key, we can actually move over to the torque wrench instead. Here we're using a 4mm hex driver, and the torque wrench itself is set to anything between 10 and 11 Newton meters. What we're going to be doing here is torquing these fasteners on the binder plate as well as the ones between the rail and the extrusion to their final torque spec. What I like to do is torque these partially, all of them, to ensure that they are snugged up and the rail is pulled against the datum surfaces before going to the full specification. So you can see I'm turning these all until they're a little bit snug, but the torque wrench isn't giving its click yet. Now we're going to go back to from the beginning and we're going to install these to the full torque specification. You can see there my torque wrench is just clicked, so I'll move on to the next fastener. And we'll continue this process along the rail for all the different supports. Once you've completed the whole rail, it is good practice to come back to the beginning and just to make sure that everything still is in specification. So give them one other click. Don't move past the click because then you'll be over torquing the fastener. Just double check that everything is still in specification once all the fasteners have been installed. At this point, once all of the fasteners on the rail are torqued to specification, now we can move on to the process of installing the bearing onto the rail itself. In this case, since we're using a 247 XL extrusion, I'm using the MOLM 0490003 bearing variant. This is the one with the hinge system that we spoke about earlier. Important thing to note is that I still have this plastic insert in the bearing. This plastic insert helps to support the bearings inside the block to ensure that they don't fall out during assembly. It also helps to prevent them from being contaminated. Now to install this on the guide rail, we will be pushing the end of this plastic insert against the rail, so we want it to contact like this. We don't want to have a gap. We want to make sure that the ball bearings are fully supported along the entire length. And I'm constantly applying pressure to this with my thumb at the back of the insert here. Now once we're doing that, we want to align the bearing with the profile of the rail. And once it starts to go on, it may require a little bit of force to get the bearing seal to compress, and then you'll see the bearing starts to jump onto the rail like that. So now that the bearing is installed on the rail, keep hold of this plastic insert for future use. If you ever need to remove the bearing from the rail, we will reinstall it again to prevent the bearing from getting damaged from corrosion and also to properly support the ball bearings inside the carriage. Now that it's on the rail, we can move on to the final torquing of the fasteners of the bearing mount onto the bearing themselves. If you recall at the beginning of the video, we only installed these finger tight. The reason for that is it's just kind of hard to do the full installation torque of 10 Newton meters if you're holding it in your hand. So I personally prefer to do it on the rail itself. So we'll be doing that for these 4 fasteners on the face of the bearing. Going in a star pattern here. So now since we're using the MOLM 0490003 bearing, the one for the XL extrusions, there are also 2 set screws on the bottom that we need to torque to specification. These will use the 3mm driver on the torque wrench, and we'll be installing them to the same torque specification of 10 Newton meters. So now that all the fasteners on your bearing mount are torqued to specification, You want to just actuate the bearing along the rail just to make sure that everything is running smooth. There will be a little bit of resistance. That's just the feeling of the seal sealing on the rail. You want to make sure that it feels smooth and consistent. If there are any irregularities, it may mean that the bearing was damaged during installation, and that will need to be investigated. Now that our bearing is fully installed, we can do our final step, which is lubricating the bearing. So we're going to take our grease gun here and align it with our Zerk fitting. And we're going to pump some grease into the bearing. Now during this step, you should wait and pump until you find grease coming out at one of the corners at either the top or bottom here. And that will indicate that the bearing is completely full of grease and it will be ready for operation for the next 100 kilometers. So once you've greased your bearing, it's a good idea to move the bearing along the rail, all along the entire length, just to distribute an even film of grease. So now that the greasing for all of your bearings has been complete, we can move on to the last step of the installation, which is installing these plastic caps into the rail. The reason we want to do this is if dirt or debris gets into the rail through one of these holes and the bearing can pass over it, it actually allows a passageway for contaminants to get back into the bearing and damage the bearing over time. So these are installed to improve the long-term life of the guide system. So you start by placing this little plastic cap inside the rail hole there. And then we use a soft blow mallet, something like a rubber or plastic mallet, to hit it so that this is flush with the rail. Now it's very important that right now this is a little bit proud of the surface, and if I actually move the rail over, you can feel the seal of the bearing hit this. We don't want this. What we want to make sure is that this is pressed flush or even a little bit recessed into the rail, and that's going to be important for the longevity of the seal on the bearing. So we'll continue installing these rough and then we'll go back and press them in all the way. So now that you've completed the installation of these plastic caps using the mallet, it's good to go through and double check with the bearing that none of them are sticking proud of the surface. If you find one of the plastic caps that are proud of the surface and you can feel it with the bearing seal, we'll want to make sure that we knock that underneath the surface. My preferred tool for this is a blunt punch with an outer diameter similar to that of the plastic cap. And what we'll do is we'll put the punch here and then hammer it just to recess that into the hole a little bit farther. And that concludes our installation of the 20mm profile linear guide rails. Thank you for watching, and if you have any further questions, please visit our documentation on Vention.com.